Well, it's interesting that you use the word heroic because, of course, the part of Stein's career that we're here to talk about tonight is a less heroic episode. And this is yet another Gertrude Stein, a Gertrude Stein who was clearly very sympathetic to the fascists and specifically to Marshal Petain when he was, during the Vichy period of France. And in particular, your book focuses on this period in 1941 when Stein translated a number of Petain's speeches, apparently with the aim to publishing them in America and spreading propaganda for him abroad. How can we possibly understand this act?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good question, and one that continues to be, troubling for me even after having written the book. So I think there's two ways to answer that question, and there's the specific and then there's the general, and I'd be happy to talk generally because I think Stein's not alone at all in being attracted to fascist or authoritarian regimes at this time, in the 20s and 30s. You scratch the surface of many of these, modernist geniuses, and you find that there's an attraction to fascism. And so the general question for me is what leads these modernist writers toward a kind of, toward a fascist or pro-fascist or authoritarian political regime? What is the connection there? So that I can just leave that out there for a second and talk specifically about Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was actually, for all of her, she presented herself as being a sort of typical American in a lot of her writings, especially later in life when she came back to the United States in 1934 and had a lecture tour that was very successful, and she presented herself as a sort of homespun American figure. Gertie was her name. And it was a very successful performance of self, going back to that idea. And I think that while she presented herself that way, she shared with many of her modernist cohorts a real elitism about her position and about the role of the artist in society. And I think one thing that she felt increasingly, especially as a result of this fame that she got in the 30s, was that she had a real role to play in guiding her country, which at that point was America, even though she had lived in France for some 30-some years, in guiding her country forward into a future that she felt was going to be a positive one. She was very critical. I mean, basically, she was very conservative, very critical of Franklin Roosevelt. She hated FDR, and she felt that the direction America was going in was toward a form of sort of socialism. I mean, she hated the New Deal, and she didn't believe in any of the welfare programs of Roosevelt. And so I think she was appalled by the direction America was going in the 30s. And then in some strange way, she saw the same thing kind of happening in France at the same time. And she went back to France after her very successful lecture tour in the 30s, and went back to a very dark world in France in the late 30s, and saw the social unrest that was going on there, and felt strongly that, as in America, there was the need for a new kind of direction in that country. And it was there that I think her attraction to Petain really was born, because even though Petain didn't come to power until June of 1940, he was sort of on the scene as a potential leader from 1936 on, as a potential leader for a new regime in France. But the other thing to say about Gertrude Stein is that she was very good friends with the other person that I talk about in my book, a man named Bernard Fay, who was a scholar of American culture and a very good friend of Stein's, but also somebody who was deeply involved with French right-wing movements in the 30s. And he is the figure, I think, who lies behind a lot of Stein's attraction, or a lot of her thinking about Philippe Petain at this time.
Right. You talk about him as a historian who really made his name as a polemicist against the Freemasons in particular, which is a group that we tend to sort of forget that the Nazis also persecuted, but in fact they were murdered in France in very great numbers.
Not in France, no.
No.
They were interned in France, but they were sent to Germany. And the reason why I'm quibbling about this is because it's very hard to get a sense of exactly whether people were sent to concentration camps in France and then to Germany as a result of being Freemasons, first of all, or whether it was because a lot of Freemasons in France at this time were also Jews. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to get a sense of exactly what it was that was putting people into camps. But historians of Freemasonry have done really good work at looking at what the rationale behind many of these deportations. The statistics are something like 600 Freemasons were killed in Germany as a result of that affiliation alone. So that would be the statistic.
So Fay now is well established as a collaborator. He was tried and sentenced to hard labor after the war. He escaped and lived the rest of his life in exile in Switzerland. And this is the man who was, as you write, one of her closest associates in the 1930s. Do you think the influence between them flowed both ways, or was it really kind of a one-way street and he guided her political thought?
Yeah. I think it was more of a one-way street than people want to admit. That is to say that I think Gertrude Stein was actually politically extremely naive. I mean, I wouldn't quibble about that at all. I don't think that any of her political pronouncements strike me as very naive. But what you see in the 30s is her making more and more statements that echo the kinds of statements that Bernard Fay is making.
Right. Like there's so speaking of her statements, so there's this one remark of hers that really leaped out of the pages of this book at me was what she said about Hitler. Yeah. So apparently in 1934, Gertrude Stein said of Hitler that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize because he was, quote, removing all elements of contest and struggle from Germany by driving out the Jews and the democratic and left elements. And it seems just unfathomable.
Yeah. And I mean, I would be interested to know from your audience, but a lot of people see this as just, black humor. Like, there's no way she could be serious about this. How could anybody seriously nominate Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1934? The rest of the sentence is interesting, though. By driving out Jews and democratic elements, he's bringing peace to Germany. Right. And it was that part of the sentence that I found very intriguing, because peace is a very loaded term for somebody like Gertrude Stein. Again, being a sort of, I would say, a writer who believes strongly in her own genius and in the fact that everybody around her needed to somehow cater to that genius, she felt that what was important as a writer was to have her routine, to have her daily life, to have a peaceful kind of environment out of which one could create this modernist masterpiece. She's not alone in thinking in those terms. There's a lot of interest at this time in the sort of how modernism emerges out of its environment. But she was saying peace is necessary for great masterpieces to be produced, which is why Paris is such an exciting city for her, because she says in Paris everything is so traditional and peaceful and habitual, and people do things the way they should, comme il faut. And so out of that environment, you can have this amazing modernism emerge. So I think the term peace for Gertrude Stein is very loaded, very suggestive. And if she is being ironic about that nomination of Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1934, she's also being serious about the salutary effects of Hitler on Germany. That's the way I read it.
It's fascinating because one wonders if there's any empirical evidence for this. That period of German history is not known for its great flowering of writers, mostly because, in fact, Nazi Germany was not a particularly peaceful place to be a writer.
Yeah. So to even make that claim, don't you think that's bizarre?
Absolutely, but she makes it on a different level. It's a claim, of course, that you see many writers making. It's in a very strange way. It's kind of a global political version of Virginia Woolf's call for a room of one's own. Mm-hmm. Writers need peace and writers need stability in order to create. Mm-hmm. And for some, it means they need someone to bring them their meals. Mm-hmm. And for others, it means they need a fascist in charge to keep all the undesirable elements at bay. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, you talked about the the thematic commonalities that you see in general between some of the other modernist writers.